Good afternoon, and thank you for joining after class. I'm really impressed that any of you might have decided that financial regulation was really the reason why you were here. So thank you very much. And what I would like to say is that having gone through all the demise of the 2007 financial crisis, the so-called Lehman crisis, or the subprime loan crisis that I will talk about, I have continued to be haunted by the idea that regulators are in fact curing the problems of the previous crisis. And I've been following all that transformation, and I'm asking myself, what's next? Where will the next one come from, and under which form? So what I'm going to try to do is, because this is a pretty dry subject, let's face it, I'm going to try to walk you through a story, and I'm going to use cartoons. So you might have heard about this country. Greece has become, for Europe, the epitome of the financial crisis. It was a small problem. It was a small crisis. But it mobilized everybody, and the governments didn't know what to do with it. So Greece had to be bailed out by the private sector and by the banks. And today, Greece is not even resolved. We are still talking about the problem of Monsieur Tsipras. We are still talking about what can Greece do to pay its next debt. What will they do to get another run of austerity? However, while the European Commission is spending time there trying to support Greece, there is a much bigger danger. That danger is called Italy. We are currently in a banking crisis in Italy. But more importantly, the problem of Italy is 5 times the size of the problem of Greece. We can't afford the collapse of Italy, but like the Pisa Tower, Italy is going down almost inexorably. Interest rates have doubled. So how, 10 years after the Lehman crisis, are we still confronted with problems of financial regulation and financial stability? It all started because in the golden years of the 90s, where we all overspent and made too much money, that everybody said the banks have become wise. And therefore, we don't need regulation. And one by one, regulation went down. The gentleman on top of this is actually Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And he said in a famous sentence, "Markets know better than regulators how to organize the granting of loans." Except that that was based on an optimistic view of what actually banks would do. What they did is this. They lied to their customers by telling them, "We have a fantastic solution for you. You are going to get a loan that will allow you to buy a bigger house or to buy your first house. It's going to cost you 2%. I was receiving in my mail incredible ideas about you are going to borrow in LIBOR. How many US citizens know what the London interbank offered rate could be? Well, they bought it. They bought it, and 2 years later, the rates were adjusted. And they couldn't pay. And in the US, you cannot renegotiate a loan. Why? Because the banks didn't keep them. Citibank, JP Morgan, Bank of America were granting you loans at 2% that ended up being loans at 7%. But the loans had already been packaged into some hedge fund kind of products. At the same time, we were in a situation where they didn't service the loans because they had sent a service contract to people who were doing that. We even went to a situation where the tsunami of those prime loans destroyed the real estate market, but more importantly, destroyed the people. And I keep thinking of the story of that single mother with 3 children who one day left the keys of her home and for 6 months lived in a car. That is what has been created there. That is where the foreclosure, which means you give the key, you don't have any liabilities anymore, but you're lost. You are forever considered to be a bad borrower. So, having gone through that, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, having gone through that, we arrived to a situation where the banks didn't know how much each of them had. And they stopped lending to each other, which they do for trillions, and they deposited that money in central banks. But all of a sudden, we were in a liquidity crisis. What does that mean? That means that nobody knew exactly the amplitude of the crisis. And it was the panic. And it was the panic of a particular weekend that I remember very well. That single weekend, on Friday, Allianz wanted to buy AIG, who became bankrupt 3 days later because they refused. Merrill Lynch was sold to Bank of America, and when Lehman was supposed to be bought by Barclays Bank, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, you might not know that it is actually the British Minister of Finance, called his US counterpart and said, we are not going to bail America out of its bad loans. 3 of the largest institutions collapsed in one weekend. And President Obama, who, by the way, was partly elected thanks to the way he handled that crisis, told Congress that under no circumstance would the taxpayer having to foot the bill. And that now he wanted a regulation whereby the banks could actually resolve their own problem. So, needless to say, what President Obama wanted to do was not totally at the taste of Wall Street. And I remember Larry Summers, that you might have heard about, he was the Secretary of the Treasury, making a presentation saying, now, as regulators, we will never assume that the bankers get it, because they don't. We have been in crisis in 1966 every 6 years because of them. Now we have to frame them. And that is how the financial system recovered until this guy came in. You remember Magritte? This is not a peep? Okay. He came in with absolutely no idea what financial stability was, with the assumption that banks were not prepared to lend money, with the assumption that everybody was being cheated and that we had to let Wall Street. So the market went up beautifully. He was there, and everybody said he has the recipe. No more regulation. Except that the result of the situation was on the right side, that over the last 10 years, the middle class had lost 40% of its wealth, and 1% of the US population owned 99% of the wealth. Doesn't particularly care about that. But what we are seeing happen is a situation where Goldman Sachs, who, by the way, is everywhere, there are at least 5 Goldman Sachs senior executives in the current administration. Goldman Sachs said this is going to reduce the wealth of the banks by 250 billion. They are not going to reduce their balance sheet, so what is going to happen? They will be weaker. So we are going a road that we know is the road of the weakening of the financial sector. And therefore, what I'm trying to say here is that it is absolutely crucial that some resistance be met so that we keep the stability of the US banking, especially because this is not about just the US. In Basel, Some of you might have been in this lovely Swiss city. They meet every quarter to try to stabilize the world. But at the G20, the United States refused to sign a commitment to free trade. So the world no longer knows whether it can count on the United States to continue maintaining financial stability. And that is the biggest risk that we are seeing. Because those guys have been extraordinary, rescuing the banking system over the last 10 years by intervening. Those are the central bankers. You have Janet Yellen from the Federal Reserve, you have Mario Draghi from the European Central Bank, and you have Mr. Kuroda from the Bank of Japan. Together, they have accumulated $10 trillion of additional assets, which means they are $10 trillion less able to rescue the next crisis. So we have the banks who are going to be deregulated, the central banks who are less able to intervene, but this is the most important message to you. We have basically tried to resolve all our political and social problems by accumulating debt. We are at a level where most of the countries have a debt that represents 100% of what they earn in 1 year. But more importantly, and maybe that's because I just got a new grandchild, I would like to point you to the father and the two children saying, someday, this will be yours, because it is yours. You are entering a world where we, our generation, has basically wasted money, created substantial climate problems. And I have to tell you something. You have to be fully awake so that it doesn't get worse and that measures are being taken. Because the politicians live on a 4-year or 5-year basis. They don't care about that. For those who followed yesterday the presidential debate, nobody talked about that. This is the biggest threat at the moment. And unless we have a serious reform of our societies, we will get very soon into either the Italian, the Chinese, or another systemic crisis. And that's what I want to avoid. Thank you very much.